Alright, so if I'm going to use this whitetail deer hide for any more of those purses, the tricky thing is, this being an early attempt at brain tanning with the hair on, which is a tricky thing, it didn't go well in the sense that it isn't supple and fully tanned. It's actually like half tanned. You can kind of hear crunch to it. So, not going to be a critical, thing that this isn't super supple. It's not going to harm a pouch. The pouch is going to be fairly stiff. It has a frame. Basically, the only reason why this is able to hold on to what hair it has is because it's not fully tanned. It's basically half, or to some degree, part rawhide, which kind of locks the hair fibers in. Yeah. So I screwed it up, but there's a bright side to it. And I don't know if I'll be able to do that again. Maybe. We'll see. But anyway, I've got plenty of material for another couple of pouches, but I want it to be more supple. So I'm going ahead and working it over this little pine stake, which I have filed over. And you can see it's polishing up quite nicely just from working the hide over it. And that way it'll be a little more supple, but it's part rawhide. You're never going to get away from it. There's going to be some stiffness to it. But again, I think, like I said before, since it's going to be a coin pouch with a brass frame around it, it doesn't really need to be real supple in the first place. You can probably get away with that. And then with the backside being vegetable tanned leather or whatever, that'll be able to flex and expand more to accommodate coins and things. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. The biggest fight is going to be this rippled effect. And there's a little bit of that on the one that I already have started. And you can see that's part of what I'm trying to work out, but I know I'm not going to get it out entirely. But on the bright side, this being the front, there's going to be, I can pick like this where there's just a few little ripples. It's not going to really damage the overall look of the pouch. Plus, you're going to have some brass elements crossing over in front of it and stuff that's going to hide some of that. And yeah, it's covered in hair. It's going to either bubble out or bubble in because of that stiffness. I think it'll be, if I select from certain areas, it'll be acceptable.
A few moments later.
I have to say, I'm actually pretty impressed. Because look at this right here. This area right here, actually tanned leather. Like, that's what you would expect from some hair-on buckskin. So, some areas, apparently were good, and I just didn't work them well enough. Areas like this, definitely a little rawhidey. And yeah, just here toward the edges. The edges are always going to be a little crispy mess. But yeah, some spots actually had enough oils in them that they just needed to be worked a little more to really prove out that they were tanned. That's crazy. I can't believe this actually turned out like this. I have to figure out how I did that. Ain't that just the way? Okay, I've just been sitting here grabbing this thing and wringing it around like a towel. And honestly, this is plenty soft enough to take from any part of it. Okay, here we go. Now you can see, it's stiff for leather, but it's definitely soft enough to pull from anywhere on here. So how do you brain tan hair on? How do you succeed in doing that? Only by accident. But it's a heck of a lot softer. Now, I wouldn't mind pulling from here where we have lots of fine crinkles. And you see how that translates over here on the fur. It's not really noticeable. But here with this big crater, like I said before, I don't know how I feel about trying to use it. Because even if it's softened, it's just that little bit of rawhide layer that's left inside here that isn't really gonna, this isn't actually stretchy like brain tan leather is, because there's that grain layer. And honestly, I could be wrong about this. There might not even be like a bit of rawhide to this. It might just be stiff because that grain layer is still on. Because typically you scrape that off so you don't have that pebble pattern like you normally would get on vegetable tan leather. It's not really the same sort of a process, so it's you get a different result. So for the recreations that I'm seeing, the brass trim that goes all around the edge is all one piece. There are a couple that I have seen. Um, well, here, let me just. So you have your brass trim, and it's flat sheet metal, right? And then at a certain point, right around here, it turns back into round wire. So obviously, it started off as round wire, and they flattened it out. So you get your round wire, you have a loop, and that's one suspension ring for this side. You gotta have the same thing on this side. So you get to the end of your loop, and then it turns back into flat sheet, and that follows all the way around the edge, and then turns into wire, loop, turns into sheet, finishes off. Super cool. But the flatter your material is, imagine trying to take a strip like this. It's 20 something gauge. You're not going to be able to take this material and make it match even that curve. You're not going to be able to bend it that way. All right, let's see if this will work this time instead of freezing. So let's say you want to make this strip start here and this will end somewhere down here, and you want to match this curve. Well, you're going to be applying force this way, right? Because you're trying to put that curve into it. So you're going to be asking this edge to stretch and this edge to compress. Well, with this material, with how thin it is, that's just not going to happen. It's going to want to buckle or twist, like I said. So you kind of have to just cut it out from one piece when it's this thin. But the thing is, the material that I'm looking at, the wire that it starts out as isn't necessarily very thick stuff, and the sheet doesn't look like it's much thicker than this, if it's really any thicker at all. It's certainly not thick enough where you could deform it that way and not run into problems. So, I have questions about how people are doing this. One possible option that I have imagined is you bend your loops out of wire and flatten the ends to match the thickness of your sheet that you're using for the rest of this trim, whatever you want to call it. And then simply butt the pieces together and braze them together to make them into one piece. Um, it could be possible to do that and not see a seam. It'd be pretty tricky, but if you have a good color match with your braze, then certainly doable. I don't know that that would be how it was done, but I'm just trying to figure out like how are people making these now and doing this. These people are making it out of wire. So you just take your starting wire, you bend it, put your little loop in it, bend it to shape, put your little loop in it, finish it off. Well, see, the problem you run into there is when you flatten it, it's going to stretch things. Not so much if you're hitting it with just a flat-faced hammer and squishing it in all directions, but that's still squishing it in all directions. It's going to deform it this way as well as this way. So at least it's not just this way, because that'll cause more problems, but you're still going to have problems. So that's not really an answer either. Unless you actually take the time to put in all that trial and error to find out we need exactly this much length of wire bent into this particular shape with these little loops, and then hammer it out and into sheet, which is a lot of hammering and heating, a lot of heating and quenching and hammering, and a lot of unpredictability really for that process. It seems like if you're doing it by hand anyway. If you're doing it like with the rolling mill or something, then you do get into really directional deformation where it'll stretch it one dimension but not the other, which, like I just said, is pretty problematic. There's not really many good answers. And if you say you have a big sheet of brass and you cut this shape out of it, now you can't really use this keyhole shape. You're pretty limited with that, right? Because you have these funky shapes. It's not like a rectangle or something or a square where you can just continue to make strips and things with it. Now you have to take your scrap piece and you can do smaller things with it, cut other things out of it, but it's still a problematic shape. I think this will do. Just roll a little further, all the way from the old wood pile yonder.
So, by my calculations, we need about 20.5 inches. We got 21 to work with here, so.
You know, honestly, that's pretty dang straight right there. I should just roll this over onto the concrete. Well, I'm not going to trust that concrete. That concrete is not flat. Well, this will be close enough. We're not struggling for perfection here. Just close enough. Yeah, well, okay. So this side, it dips down. I can even see that. This is high compared to this, so it would need to be trimmed that way. Or simply just let it lay how it lays, call that flat, and then level the top, which, I don't know. I also definitely don't need this much surface. I only need a little piece of it, so I could probably shave the sides down too if I really wanted to, or try to split some of the side off, because it's just going to take up more space than it needs to down there. It's already a tight enough workspace, so I'll probably do some of that too. So, forging out some wire for a frame like this is one thing. That's one headache. But on fragments from the artifacts and things, there are lines, like two lines that have been. I'm gonna say that they weren't chiseled in because just what that would do. So when you're working with these curves and things, and you're trying to get in there with the chisel, yeah, it's just things are going to deform and stretch all over, and it's going to be the same initial nightmare you're going through here all over again. I wonder if those pieces were cast as one long bar So if you imagine this all as one long bar, right? Nice and straight, and then you just have your section that switches over to round wire, and then it flattens back out again. And then the size of this will be determined by the dimensions, whatever you make with your patterned wire that you have poured into a soapstone mold or something maybe. And then all you have to do is, like I said, if this is thick enough, because this is not that thick, turns out. Forging this out to get this width. And which way is it going to want to deform? It's going to resist deforming into this curve. This is really, really fighting the material. It's going to want to deform this way, not, it's well supported. If you flatten a piece out and you try to hammer it one way or another, it just doesn't work well. The physics are against it. So if you have your mold and you carve down into it your rectangular wire shape, and then you carve into those some little channels or grooves. That way you end up with your line pattern, your decorative pattern on the surface of the wire. Really, you could just draw out your shape, carve that out of your soapstone mold, leave the ends long and straight, and that would accommodate doing this just fine, because if you switch from flat to round at some point, it's gonna bend real easy at the round. So you would just be straight, flat, switch to round, straight, flat for a little bit, and then you just come in and only bend that, and then there's even less work that way. So I wonder if maybe something like that is how it was done. Like, this is just ridiculous as it is, and I'm definitely not going to try to put any patterns along this, just because, like I said, it's going to open up this same can of worms all over again, and things are going to want to stretch and move in funky ways, and I'm going to lose the shape after fighting so hard to get the shape to begin with. So I'm thinking this is not the way it was done. It's just too much for too little, really. Like, you don't get those decorative elements. And yeah, I could be wrong here, but it's just the impression that I get after struggling at this for a while. You can see I'm getting close, but this is getting funky right here. Like, these little curves are a very tricky spot. And then doing this loop on this side to mirror is going to be very tricky as well. And after that, it's just flatten it out and finish it off. And then I'm going to find a different method, because this is not a viable method. This is intense and tricky and funky and weird. It's a cool result, kind of. I don't know what I'm going to do for the backside, because this needs to rivet to the leather. So I don't want to do this again. That's a problem we have to solve. I might just kind of do that one piecemeal, chopping it out of brass that I have here. But, the original looks like, well, the more complete original, excuse me, looks like it's made out of one piece, which makes sense because you want it to be a solid frame. If it's got the solid frame on one side, you don't really need it so much on the other side, but the other side would be nice to be solid as well. Okay, so I just chopped my piece of brass down there, drew some lines to either side so I know roughly how much that will cover. So that's where things will be riveted through, obviously through there. Any stampings that I'm going to do shouldn't pass that line. That's just for the sake of things looking clean. So now I can kind of plot that stuff out, go ahead and do it. I might do this pattern, might do something different. I was planning on experimenting with these other ones, but this is the bigger issue. If I want to make more, I've got to find a better way, or a different way. Probably not with these loops being part of all one piece. What I've seen some other people do is actually rivet on a separate piece that is the loop, which would simplify this quite a bit. Even if I did go ahead and move forward with forming the metal like I did here, make this keyhole shape all one piece, that would be quite a bit simpler, because what I've discovered is actually this border that I drew, that seems to be kind of a sweet spot for, like if I take the wire and I form it to that, well, you can't really do it first because just the way things expand and shift as you're going. So by necessity, you have to just take small bites and move along. But if I take my straight piece here and then I form that bend and I begin following this curve, as long as I continue forming the next section to follow that inside curve, when I hammer it, it seems like it expands and runs to the outside about where I need it to go. So that's kind of handy. So if I go ahead and do that, then I will just be, run my my wire down through here where it would normally be, where you would imagine it, filling this space, and then hit this corner, and then follow this inside line. What I've seen mentioned based on the really, really complete find, or the find with the really complete frame, that is, I think one of the, I think it was like based off of some of the fur found attached still to the bottom of the brass, that they guessed it was some sort of like a squirrel fur or something. So that's thin leather, but the space between the little bits of rivets that remain sticking through the metal, which would, you know, go from the front through the leather to the back to whatever plate is back there, it was much thicker than what those two pieces of leather theoretically should have been, especially like if one is actually squirrel leather. That's some thin stuff. So what was very reasonable that one person suggested would be, well, okay, easy. You just have a strip of leather running along the perimeter there, and it gives it the extra thickness, and you also increase the volume of the pouch by doing that. It's like, yeah, that would make sense. So I actually might take this thing apart and go ahead and do that. If I don't do it to this one, if I go ahead and make a couple more, I want to do it to those. The other thing is, though, this design has a button closure, and I don't have any buttons yet. Those are on the way. When they arrive, I'm not sure how I want to attach them, because I don't think sewing directly to this would be the strongest way to attach them. I kind of think I might be better off doing something like cutting some slits into the leather so that the button, the back end of the button, can fit through, and I'll show you basically how these buttons are designed, so it'll make sense how I'm going to be doing this, or I think I might be doing this, so that back end of the button can fit through, and then I can weave through maybe like a little bit of leather lacing, or even just run it through the back of the buttons. That way, that way the buttons are held a little closer to the surface here, and so this will close nice and close instead of being flipped open like that. And then when the buttons are pulled on, it's stressing that little piece of leather in the back that's running through them, which if it was a piece of wire, it would be a bar that they're all pulling on. But same sort of idea. And that way it's not directly stressing this, and you don't have little stitches here and there that could tear through more easily. So might do that, might not. Still trying to figure it out, thinking about it. Okay, company is gone. Some other chores and things taken care of. Gotta get back to this. So, instead of doing what I did here, which was roughly measure out a distance, hammer it flat, leave a certain distance relatively unhammered, and then flatten and just kind of chase progress along to the other side. Because this is a much simpler shape and it doesn't involve those weird little twisty curlicue suspension rings, I'm going to try a different approach. So this time, I'm going to try to just make a pass hammering, and then make a pass hammering, anneal, and then just try to make even progress across the full surface and hope that there's less distortion to the shape that way. So, yeah, the hope is because I'll be basically trying to evenly deform instead of working sections like this. Hopefully, everything just kind of flattens out evenly and it holds this shape by and large. There probably will be some tweaking still, but that's fine. If I can minimize that, I'll be happy. Okay, so the problem I'm running into, and it's not a bad problem, is when I go through and hammer this, it's actually moving in a way I wasn't expecting. And that is, when I hammer, this actually all closes up. Which I guess kind of makes sense if I'm laying my hammer blows. Well, no, not even necessarily heavier through here. It's just that this is straight, so as this expands in every direction, it's growing in length and width. And then as I hammer here, it's gonna kind of expand and want to straighten out a little bit. And so as I hammer around in here, it's gonna expand and so anyway, well, yeah, I don't fully get it. It just depends where my hammer blows are laying. This is all done by hand, so it's not gonna be super accurate. But anyway, it's overall kind of closing up, more or less like that. Very very tight keyhole shape. But the good side is, it's much easier to stretch this back out to the vase kind of shape that I'm looking for. Easier to do that than to try to squeeze it together. Um, when you're squeezing it together, you're trying to compress all this right in here, right? And then this outside is stretching because you're. It makes sense. Whereas stretching this back out, this is a pretty wide surface, and then you're stretching this side more while you're trying to compress this, but you have all this space that you're trying to do that in. It's a little more forgiving, I guess. But it moving into more of a tight keyhole shape makes more sense if my hammer blows are causing the wire to lengthen more than widen, because that would result in this growing in length and forcing this closed. Getting closer, one thing I decided to try. So, when you hit with a relatively flat hammer face, so let's say I imagine a ball of Play Doh right there. I hit the Play Doh. It's going to expand in every direction, right? Given the shape of this hammer face. What happens if I use this side? Strike the Play Doh. It's going to expand this way, right? Less than this way. It's gonna divide the Play Doh. You can do that to lengthen something, but you can also do it to widen something. So I decided, you know what? It's not widening as fast as I'd like to see it do that. So I'm going to come in here and use the hammer this way. These curves are a little tight for it, but we'll just see how it all works out. Well, these curves are a little tight for trying to use this guy on it, but we'll see what happens. So I went ahead and did that, and it's definitely better for it. So I already knew that little principle of metal working, but I decided, let's see if these curves still behave while trying this, because there's a chance it could send these all wonky and maybe not be worth it. And yeah, just some minor tweaking. I just had to open this up a little bit wider again to match, and it's following the lines now. I did just before like the last picture that I did. I think you could see there were 3 lines marked on one side, and that's actually I had to account for things were starting to lengthen out a little too much, and I had to move this bend back a little bit from where I had originally marked it out. But since doing that, it's all been pretty good so far. So keep going with this, and I think we'll be in the ballpark enough to just let it go, and then mark out where the holes. Lay this one out underneath that one, and mark the holes and drill them, and of course, after sawing these ends off, polishing it up a little bit, yada yada yada, things are looking on the up and up. That said, though, I do think if I make more, I'd as cool of a detail as the little curlies are, and that's one of the main attractive things to me about this style of coin purse is that that was all one piece. Like that's one of the things that really drew me to it. It's not just a ring riveted on there. I don't know that I want to go through that again, and I don't know that I can think of a really easy way to take this idea that seems to be working out really well and transfer it over to incorporate those. Because, like I said, even with this one, I did have to shift that curve right here. It was either this one or that one from the original marking back a little bit to accommodate for the stretching that was happening. And I mean, you only get one shot at that with this going at it with this method. So it's either you just let it be what it's going to be and let the frame dictate the size of the pouch, or you get super accurate somehow. And I'm not there yet. I don't know. There might be other little tricks and details to getting this to behave just so, and do it. And I'm not quite there yet, but I'm definitely able to, as we can see, do the simple frame and then rivet on a separate little curly and find a way to make that attractive, which I did see some out there which I would consider fairly attractive little coin purses that did things that way. So it's just a lot of stress and effort and time for that style. Most things I say, oh, it's not really that hard, it's just tricky, and I would consider this a hard level of tricky. So alright, so you can see they don't line up perfectly. You can see how that's wider on the top, but things flex enough that they will close together, and when things are riveted, it'll, between the leather and everything being riveted together and all that, it'll all be in tension and lined up well enough. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, one on top of the other. The way that you can only get things so close doing this. So I'm gonna go through, clean up little rough spots, little dents and dimples here and there. Take a file to it, go around the edge, outside, inside, just a little bit. I don't mind some of those marks being there, just to take out the worst of them, like this spot right here, even that out. Then I'll clean up the face, what is going to be showing. Oh crap, which side is going to be the? Oh yes, this side is. This is the side that'll be showing. So I'll clean up that, because you can see. Maybe you can't see the hammer marks. I'd like to keep some of that, but I would like to also kind of soften, because when you go to polish things back, you're going to be hitting all those high spots, and then those lows aren't going to get hit. But if you sand things down a little bit and kind of soften all those little hard lines, those little facets that are left there from hammering, I find that it blends a little better and polishes up, kind of like this. Well, we get all these fingerprints now, but so you can still see those hammer marks, and it show up as little facets. but because I took the abrasive rubber wheel and went across the surface and everything, it softened all those peaks. So it's not like something like this, which isn't as shined up and polished. There's still oxide on this, but you can see really well all of the dings and things. But having softened those up on this side, they're a lot less obvious, but it's still clearly hand hammered.